Well, that was
there we go. It was the running of a separate channel. Double
good.
running.
Well, that was a living example of regional identity that might have surprised you from Joyce Quin, one of our speakers, who's going to be the first speaker. Joyce, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Joyce Quin, of course, was a long-time member of the European Parliament and then an MP, 1987 to well into the 21st century. She was a minister and one state minister of Europe, and she's now in charge of the Northeast body, which supervises art collections and museums in the Northeast of the country. So it's very kind of her to be able to tell us what she thinks about English federalism, which is something that has been referred to throughout our regional sessions earlier, and it will be very useful for us to have her take on it. Then we're going to have Professor Talbot, who I'll introduce after Joyce is finished. Joyce, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan. I'm hoping everybody can hear me all right, and that my voice sounds better than my pipe playing. And anyway, I have been following the event on YouTube, and I just make a couple of comments about what I'd heard so far before saying what I feel in answer to the question that I've been specifically posed. The role of the House of Lords was mentioned before, and perhaps I can say that although I'm a member of the House of Lords, I'm very much in favour of the idea of a Senate of the nations and regions. The present House of Lords does have a lot of strengths, but one of the major weaknesses is that it doesn't provide a strong and fair representation across the whole of the UK, and that is a shortcoming which certainly needs addressing, in my view, particularly in the current situation. Also, I was playing there the Northumbrian pipes, and that is the tune that I was playing is called "Because He Was a Bonny Lad," and the title, I think, already emphasises the links that there are between Northumberland and Scotland. And so I was very interested in the presentations on Scotland earlier. I must say that particularly because of disastrous Brexit, the border situation in an independent Scotland, for us living nearby and having very many links across the border, seems to be something of a nightmare scenario, made much more complicated by Brexit. And although I yield to no one in my enthusiasm for the EU, the kind of family and bonds and emotional bonds, as well as economic bonds across the border, make for many of us who feel very much British in this part of the world rather than English, something to really be dreaded if it came about. And I just wanted to say that simply because the emotional arguments for the union, I don't think get made very often, but I think they are strong, as the economic arguments are too. Anyway, to the English issue, the question about is England too big for a federal UK? David Gow said earlier that England was the elephant in the room, and that it's getting bigger. And I think that he's right, and that the disastrous Brexit process has made the English question even more difficult than it was before. Is England too big for a federal UK? Well, my immediate answer would be yes, if the federation is of 4 parts, simply because of the asymmetry in population. And the fact that even if Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland weren't there, England would be an over-centralised country with its large population of 56 or so million, and the need to improve the democratic deficit and tackle the democratic deficit within England. I don't feel that an English Parliament could do that, particularly since English identity is not as strong as Scottish, I would say, as Scottish or Welsh identities, basically because so many of us have mixed heritage and there are such strong local and regional identities within England. And when earlier on people were talking about the English interest, I sort of feel in a country that's marked by, particularly by the North-South division, which in some ways is stronger than the divisions between nations in the UK, that basically an English Parliament would just duplicate the problem of over-centralism that we have already in the existing UK Parliament. I wanted to refer just to a ministerial experience I had when I was a minister in the Home Office dealing with prisons. And it was just before devolution really got going. And I spent 3 days with the Scottish Prison Service. And at the end of those 3 days, I felt I'd rather be prisons minister in Scotland than in England and Wales. And the reason for that was simply the scale involved. That Scotland, you had a small number of prisons, small number of probation areas. You could bring the key players very easily together and then hammer out a policy that you were all happy with. That was much more difficult in England and Wales when you were talking about things on a much greater scale. And this made me reflect on the fact that when we're talking about devolution, we're not just talking about devolution in terms of national identity, but we are talking about decentralization, and that concept that doesn't get much of a mention now, but which is important in my view, which is that of subsidiarity, making decisions at the lowest possible level, the closest level to the citizen. And it seems to me that in our current state of devolution, that we're overlooking that important decentralization and subsidiarity agenda. Now, we can ask the question, has devolution nonetheless can it be considered a success? In some ways, I think that it can be, and that the devolved institutions particularly in Scotland, but also the Senedd in Wales, Northern Ireland is obviously, as we've just heard, is special in this respect. But in terms of Scotland and Wales, the devolved institutions which have been set up look durable and look set to last. However, one can't really say the same of England, which has got a very confused situation. Apart, I get from, I guess, London, where I think the London Assembly and the London mayoral system is probably here to stay. I think one thing that puzzles us sometimes in the northeast of England when we're looking across the border to our Scottish friends and neighbours is that we often feel quite envious of the benefits of devolution there, particularly when we see the fruits of policies which many of us support, but which seem impossible to implement in England. Measures such as free prescriptions, an absence of university tuition fees, free social care, the right to roam, more generous agricultural grants, and various other policies which look very attractive to us. And yet the irony is that particularly SNP-led nationalism seems to air grievances all the time rather than celebrate any of the things that they have been able to achieve under a devolved system. I think there is something there that we do need to reflect on. It's a little bit like it used to be in the EU, with the government blaming the EU for everything they didn't like, and not giving the EU credit for the many benefits and rights that we enjoyed. Anyway, it does seem to me that the English situation is perhaps more of a priority to deal with than devolution elsewhere, with the exception of Northern Ireland, where obviously events are happening at the moment, which demand attention. But the real democratic deficit does seem to me to be in England. What we've seen so far in terms of attempts towards devolution has been piecemeal and often driven from the centre. And despite the rhetoric of levelling up, which is, I believe, largely just rhetoric, there still is a marked north-south divide. When I say that devolution has been driven from the centre rather than from the regions and localities, this has been happening for a long time. We could even go back to the Heath government in the 70s and the creation of the metropolitan counties and the alteration of county boundaries, very often not to the satisfaction of local residents. Then we had Mrs. Thatcher, who then decided to get rid of the metropolitan counties, basically because she didn't like Ken Livingstone. And that was, as far as we were concerned in the Northeast, a retrograde step, because things like our integrated transport system in the county of Tyne and Wear then disappeared at the same time as the Met counties were abolished. We also had a rather sad tale of regional development agencies. In the Northeast, the business and unions came together to create a development agency before the Labour government granted us one statutorily when it came into office. But then that regional development agency got abolished with all the other regional development agencies. And it seemed to me that some regional development agencies perhaps weren't working particularly well, but to abolish all of them on this sort of central driven policy seems really to be an example of what I'm saying about how these moves towards devolution have been centrally driven, with often not taking the different situations and circumstances in the different regions into account. Now, we've also mentioned during the course of the day the issues around referendums and regional devolution, and particularly in London, was brought in via a referendum. In the Northeast, our referendum was went the other way, even though opinion polls prior to, in the years up to the referendum, had shown that people in the Northeast wanted a voice of their own. That referendum was now quite a long time ago in very different circumstances. And perhaps I could say that we need a Northeast referendum again, perhaps before any other referendums take place in other parts of the UK. In recent years, we have seen a move towards elected mayors, and there have been some successes there. And some of the mayors in the north of England have been able to do things and also raise the profile of their areas, such as Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester or Steve Rotherham in Liverpool. In the Northeast, however, so far the system hasn't really worked very well. And again, part of the reason has been because of central government interference. There was a move by the Conservative government to force elected mayors on particular cities, and there were referendums in Newcastle and Sunderland which it resulted in votes against such mayors, and because of that it's been quite difficult to move forward with what might have been a way of achieving some form of devolution. And at the moment we have a north of Tyne mayor, but not any elected mayors south of the Tyne until you get to Teesside, which is a different case. There are currently moves to try and and get something that would be an elected mayor for the whole of the northeast minus Teesside, and there may be a sign of hope there. But it is rather ironic that despite feelings of distinctness and a distinct economic identity, which there certainly is in the northeast, that the whole process towards decentralisation and devolution has been frustratingly slow. In terms of the current situation, as well as the Conservatives presumably continuing with the policy of trying to encourage directly elected mayors, the Labour Party has undertaken a commission under Gordon Brown looking at some of the issues, and in particular looking at the issue of devolution within England. How do we move forward? Let me try and conclude briefly. If a future government wants the union to work for all parts of the UK, I think it is going to have to rethink some of the approaches which have been taken so far. I think for a Labour government, the union still is very important. I mean, the Labour Party was created by the struggle for workers' rights and better social conditions across the whole of the UK, perhaps embodied by the role of Keir Hardie himself, who was a Scot, but who represented a London seat for a while and then represented Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. And the NHS was founded by a Welsh Secretary of State and a government headed by an Englishman belonging to a party founded by a Scot. And I think there are ways, those of us who want the union to survive, to move forward if we want the union to work, but in a devolved manner. Let me throw out finally just a few suggestions. I mean, you could have a future government could have a kind of department for the union, a government department looking at ways for the union to work better without undermining the existing devolved settlement, but looking at such issues as cross-border projects or ways in which each part of the union could learn from what is happening elsewhere. The idea of the Senate of Nations and Regions has already been mentioned. And then there's also the idea of a constitutional convention for England. I think if that does happen, it has to be genuinely cross-party and involve different parts of civil society. I don't think it should operate in a way which would simply repeat some of the centralised decisions of the past, which have proved not appropriate. So back to the question, it seems to me that England at present constituted is too big for a federal UK, but I do believe there are ways of tackling that problem while not undermining the principle of devolution across the UK. But I don't believe that that is an easy process. It's a difficult challenge, but I certainly hope that it can be responded to.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments and questions on your very stimulating presentation. Thank you again. We're now, before we go to comments and questions from the audience, going to ask Professor Colin Talbot. Good afternoon, Colin, again. Nice to see you. He's the he's the Emeritus Professor of Government at the University of Manchester and a Research Associate at the University of Cambridge. He's also a Senior Research Fellow with the Federal Trust. Over the years, he's advised and counselled many national governments and sub-governmental bodies. Colin, what do you think, in answer to the question, is England too big for a federal UK?
Yes. Next question. I've been thinking about this issue of federalism for some years now, and this may sound, by the way, like Joyce and I have coordinated our presentations, although we haven't actually spoken before today, because some of the things I'm going to say is going to mirror and I hope extend a bit on some of the issues that Joyce was raising about decentralisation and subsidiarity. Because I spent quite a lot of time thinking about federalism in the way that we normally do. And with respect, I think a lot of today's been around federal thinking in the traditional way of being fairly top-down, thinking about national identities and the structure of the British Union. And that's fairly normal, and it's a correct decision, the correct discussion to have. But I think it's missing an important half of the discussion about what's government for. And I'm not going to go through this slide, but this was when I was thinking about this, about what sort of federal mechanisms we'd need in the UK. But I fairly quickly came to the conclusion that maybe we were asking the wrong question. Maybe we ought to be thinking in a more bottom-up way about how you construct government. And I came across this absolutely fascinating book from 1933 by Hyam, as you can see. What's interesting, I don't know if you can, I hope people can read the chapter headings in there, but this book, it introduces the way government works from a citizen level point of view. So rather than talking about the Constitution and the Houses of Parliament and the judiciary and the executive and all those things, it talks about roads and light and power and the water mains and trams and buses and schools and housing, and discusses how all of those things are delivered in the system as it existed in 1933. And it's got me thinking that maybe we ought to be thinking a lot more about this sort of bottom-up approach and the role that government plays at all levels in British society, not just at the union level and the relationship between the national parts of the UK, but at lower levels as well. And my experience of the debate is that we've had for 30 years or so, I've been involved in studying government. We've had two completely separate debates, one around devolution and one around local government. And ne'er the twain shall meet. It's very rare that you hear a discussion about the overall structure of government in the UK. This was brought home to me by an American colleague. We had a discussion some years ago, and we were discussing how many elected governments there were in the United States. And I'll tell you the number in a minute, but it got me thinking, how many elected governments are there in the UK? And I've tried this out on a number of people, including some people in government who ought to know, and they don't, by and large. People have no idea, because the truth is, we've got over 12,000 elected governments in the UK, if you include all levels of government. We've got local authorities, we've got somewhere around 400 local authorities across all four nations. But below that, we've also got things like community councils in Scotland and community councils in Wales, and parish and town councils in England. And one of the things that I think the pandemic showed was that actually a lot of these lower tier forms of government, particularly around local authorities and town and parish councils, played a quite critical role in helping to organise the response to the pandemic, and could play a much more important role in the future. By the way, the answer for the United States is they have 93,000 governments in the elected governments in the United States, which is sort of proportionally probably about right compared to where we're at. So I'm going to keep this relatively short because I'm more interested to find out what other people think about this. My argument would be that what we need to think about is, rather than federalism by itself, we need to think about multi-level government across the whole of the UK, the point that I think Joyce was making. I completely agree with her that the UK is too centralised, and I would include it that it's too centralised within the devolved nations, particularly Scotland. The SNPs had a very strong centralising tendency with the creation of things like a single police force for the whole of Scotland, which seems to me to be entirely inappropriate. And I utterly agree with Joyce's comments about prisons. I mean, I was involved, I was on the review of the English and Welsh prison service after the Derek Lewis affair back in 1996-97. And we looked at the whole management and organisation of the prison service. And I've also done work with prison services in a number of other countries. And the one thing that strikes you about prisons, for example, is that the most effective prison and probation services are the most localised ones, because as the head of the Canadian Corrections Agency said to me, the two things that determine whether or not people reoffend when they get out of prison, most of them are in for short sentences, is do they still have strong family relationships in the area, and do they have a job to go back to? Neither of those things can be accommodated in a prison system where people end up suffering sentences sometimes 200-300 miles away from where their family links are. And it simply doesn't work. And yet no government, Labour or Conservatives, has been willing to address that issue, because it is a big structural issue to change the prison system, to get away from very large warehouse prisons and get back to the sort of local prisons. I happen to live in Bedford, and we have a very old-fashioned local prison in the middle of the town, which could, I mean, it's got major structural problems because of its age, but it could well be a much more effective system, and the nucleus of a much more better system for criminal justice than some remote prison somewhere on the moors. So I completely agree. And there's a lot of other parts of government which we simply don't even think about. So, for example, if you take the taxation system, we have Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is responsible for the collection of nearly all taxes in the UK, with the exception of things like council tax. In Denmark, nearly all taxes are collected by local government. Although the tax rates are set nationally, the administration and collection of taxes are run through local government. That massively strengthens local government. It means it's got much bigger administrative capacity. It knows its local areas. They have much higher compliance rates with taxation because the tax officers are actually located locally and part of the local system. And this applies to a whole load of other systems at national level. The three big ones for UK government are tax, benefits and prisons. As Joyce said, prisons is the only one where we've actually devolved them effectively. So Northern Ireland and Scotland have their own prison systems. Wales still doesn't have a separate prison system to England. And it's absolutely clear to anybody who's worked with prisons that particularly the Scottish system works an awful lot better for the reasons that Joyce said earlier. So I think we need to think about strengthening and expanding local government. I think we need to relook at those things that have been taken away from local government, like control of education. I think we need to look at those parts of public services that have no local democratic control over them at all, the biggest of which, most important of which, is the health service. And when we're talking about trying to integrate health and social care, we're actually moving in the opposite direction, where we've taken social care away from local government to a large extent and are now moving it into a non-democratically controlled system, again, controlled indirectly from Whitehall most of the time. And I think we need to look at strengthening and expanding local government. I wrote a piece recently about saying that we needed local government in the UK that was both bigger and smaller, in the sense that it needed to cover a wider range of functions. But our units of local administration, compared to most of the rest of Europe and the United States for that matter, tend to be much larger in terms of population. And it would be quite possible to have much smaller units, but with a much wider range of powers that could actually govern things in their areas. And then build on top of that the sort of things that we've seen with the creation of things like combined authorities in some areas, which have worked extremely well. I've lived in Manchester for many years, and the combined authority in Manchester was a huge success long before Andy Burnham came along, and was doing all sorts of interesting things. The important point for me about where federalist principles come in and what's absolutely missing from the UK system is mutual respect across different tiers of government, and recognising and clarifying what the different roles of government should be. It's well known in Whitehall, anybody who's worked in and around Whitehall knows that, unfortunately, both politicians and civil servants in Whitehall have very little respect for other tiers of government. They don't trust them. Their first reaction to any sort of crisis is to go for some sort of national solution. And we saw this absolutely clearly in the pandemic. Local government has track and trace facilities in public health in local government. They do it routinely for things like food poisoning outbreaks or E. coli outbreaks or sexually transmitted diseases. They do it on a regular basis. What was government's reaction? Set up a national system, set up a national centralised system for the whole of England, and it, because it's a Tory government, hand it over to their mates in the private sector to run. It was completely dysfunctional. Eventually, after about 18 months, they got round to recognising the role that local government could play and did play in trying to operate the testing and tracking and tracing system at a locality level. But that could have been done locally to start with. The other part of that, if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, at some point they had the bright idea of calling for volunteers to come forward to help the NHS and other services. And what did they do? They set up a national database of all these volunteers. And then when they got in 100,000 or whatever it was names, somebody had to work out what they were going to do with them. Because they had these people scattered all over the country. They had no idea what they were going to do. And eventually it, at least partially, devolved back to local government, which is where it should have been done in the first place. In most localities, local governments and parts of civil society like churches and mosques and gurdwaras and various other people got involved in actually organising things like the vaccination centres, things like test and trace, things like making sure that people who were vulnerable were getting looked after. So I think one of the problems is that we've got this culture in the UK of central government knows best, Whitehall knows best, and utter disrespect for other tiers of government, to the extent that the slide I showed you earlier of the number of elected governments we have comes as a shock to even senior civil servants when you say we've got 12,000 elected governments in the UK. They sort of try and come up with reasons as to why they don't really exist or they're not really important when they could easily be very important. So that's my point, is that we need to, just stop sharing. My point is that we need to start thinking very differently about government as a whole across these islands that we live on, and thinking about how the different parts of government relate to one another, and especially start to look from the bottom up to what citizens know and citizens get from government. Ipsos Mori do a regular poll question in one of their surveys they do every year about who citizens think are responsible for various public services. And every year they get results that show that most citizens haven't got a clue who's responsible for things like hospitals or probation services or prisons or policing. That's partly understandable because we don't teach civics in schools, but it's also because it's such a mess. And we haven't really rethought how we use government institutions and how they best serve the people for many, many years.
Thank you very much indeed. Another very comprehensive and stimulating contribution. I'm sure there'll be lots of things that people want to discuss and ask questions about. I'll throw it open if I may. David.
I'm just reading in comments from David Gow, who made earlier, saying that decentralisation and subsidiarity are essential. The Scottish government is far too centralised and needs to devolve powers. And he also points out that the Joint Ministerial Committee is unknown and inactive and should be taking up all these issues.
Can I just comment on that?
Sorry?
Can I just comment on that?
Colin wants it, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and in January, nobody noticed, but in January, there was a joint committee set up along the lines of intergovernmental committees that exist in other federations, in proper federations, full-blown federations, between the Westminster government and the governments of Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And it was supposed to have a secretariat set up in the Cabinet Office, which would be independent of the Cabinet Office and run jointly by the four governments. to my knowledge, I keep asking the Cabinet Office every so often, first of all, has the Ministerial Committee ever met? We're now at the end of October. To my knowledge, there's never been a meeting of the Ministerial Committee. And they haven't even set up, as far as I'm aware, I may be wrong, they haven't even set up the Secretariat. So 10 months later, after this supposed innovation was put in place, nothing's happened.
Briefly, one question for both before I start. What do both of you think are the mechanisms whereby the changes will come about that you want? Colin, perhaps, particularly, would be interested in that question.
Yeah, I think we need to go back a step. One of the things that's fallen out of favour in British public administration is the idea of a royal commission. And I do think actually in this respect, thinking about looking at the whole of governments, plural, across the UK, there is scope for establishing something like a royal commission where we took a step back and re-examined how government serves the public and where various parts of government activity, like prisons and taxes and benefits payments, could be best placed. Towards the end of the Labour government, they started thinking about this a bit when they had the Total Place initiative, which was run by Mike Bichard, and looking at how much public money was being spent in particular areas. And we did a study for the BBC looking at Greater Manchester, and well over half of public money in Greater Manchester was not spent by Manchester local authorities or Manchester local services. It was being spent by central government in Greater Manchester. And I think we really need to start having a look at all that whole system and thinking about how that could be better controlled locally, because all the evidence is that by and large, most services that governments provide are local, and local control, local flexibility, local accountability, I think, are absolutely crucial to making them work properly. So I think some sort of mechanism to step back and look at it. But I also think those people advocating for this need to have a sort of roadmap or a set of principles that we want to establish and examine every policy and say, does this lead us in the direction of a more decentralized, accountable, locally delivered set of services, or does it not? And I think if we started asking some of those questions about some areas of public policy, we'd start to make some progress.
Joyce, would you be willing to serve on a royal commission?
Certainly, if these were the issues it was looking at. I mean, I think that such an approach would be a good idea, and perhaps even should precede something like a constitutional convention, because the Royal Commission could really identify a lot of the issues that something like a constitutional convention could look at. I was very struck with the example that Colin gave of local authorities' expertise not being properly used during the COVID crisis, and trying to sort of solve the COVID challenges on a kind of England, Scotland, Wales basis, rather than on a much better coordinated but decentralized basis. I really felt very strongly that what he said about that ought to be a lesson that we learn from the COVID experience.
Good. Andrew, you wanted to say something about representativity of the regional interest.
Yes, listening to the conversation, for which many thanks, I'd just like to draw attention to some work that myself and Sam Wimster are doing on setting up or reforming the upper house, which is not related specifically to what Gordon Brown is doing, but we come at this at a slightly different point of view. Both of us have quite extensive experience of Germany, having lived and worked there. And in particular, we're interested in looking at the Bundesrat. Now, for those of you who do not know what the Bundesrat does, it's a place where the lender, which in this case could just be the devolved territories, but they could also be the regions in England, which would have to be created, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The interesting thing about the Bundesrat is, first of all, it's much smaller than the House of Lords. The second point is this, and I think the two previous speakers have hinted at this. Indeed, conference, there is no place in the British Constitution at the moment where the regions themselves can talk amongst themselves about what central policies the federal government is actually doing. And the advantage of the Bundesrat is that they do in fact have specific obligations under the Constitution there to do that. And this may seem a relatively small point, but actually it has profound constitutional implications for the way in which this country is governed. Because there are certain kinds of legislation and certain kinds of policies where the Bundesrat has to be consulted. And in certain cases, they can overrule the central government, in this case, House of Commons. Now, it's only for certain limited areas. The Bundesrat, though, is also able to take an initiative if they see that the policy coming out of the House of Commons looks like it's going to have a regional impact. They can then say, we need to be involved. We don't have, as far as I can see, anything like this in the UK at all. And I would beg to submit, in a way, that to construct something like this would perhaps be a significant step forward under two scenarios.
Oh, quickly.
Yes,
quickly.
one scenario would be if we did go to a federal UK solution, that would include the devolved nations, and the devolved nations plus still to be defined English regions committed or given real resource allocation possibilities as well. Or in the case of where there wasn't a federal solution for the UK, but we were left with England and Wales, that we would then, or possibly not even Wales, then there would be English regions that would be represented in Parliament, as it were, at the centre, with specific obligations and liabilities and recommendation powers to look at the regional issues. And this is an ongoing project which we're working on at the moment, and perhaps we can talk about later on.
Excellent. Can we have some comments about the Bundesrat model from Joyce first, if you wouldn't mind?
Yes, I think there is a lot in what Andrew says. I mean, my own, whether we were talking about a Royal Commission or a Constitutional Convention, I would see the role, an important role of that body to look at the experience of devolution elsewhere, particularly in the EU, and also what works well so far in our own devolved settlement in the UK. I find the lender system a very interesting and attractive one in many ways. It's you know, there are some parallels because some of the lender, you know, were sort of long established separate identities in the past in Germany. Others are a fairly artificial creation, but actually in practice seems to have worked well. I was also struck when German reunification took place that one of the fairly smooth transitions, as I understood it, was to incorporate the new lender in the former East Germany into the overall Bundesrat and lender system operating in the rest of Germany. So I do think there are a lot of lessons there, and looking at some of the mechanics and the relationship of the Bundesrat to the Bundestag and the federal government, I think could provide many interesting examples for us to possibly emulate.
Colin.
Yeah, I would just point out that, I mean, I agree with the points about the upper house being more representative of the regions and so on, but I'd just point out that you can actually operate existing systems in very different ways. When I was studying back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was doing international comparisons of the way in which different governments had implemented various forms of performance measurement across the public services. And I was really struck by how some places were doing things completely differently, but within the existing structure. So, for example, the Department for Health and Human Services in the United States, I went over to study some of the things they were doing. They were doing a very innovative process of dialogue between the federal government and the state governments about the way in which they were distributing some of their funding. And it was very much a sort of adult-to-adult relationship rather than the way we tend to refer to it here as parent departments looking after their various children. And I thought that I was struck by that. Similarly, I mean, in Poland, for example, the local authorities developed their own way of measuring their performance and shared it amongst themselves and refused to let central government be involved in it at all, which was partly a reaction to the old Stalinist system in the past. And there were lots of variations like this across different countries who were able to operate the existing structures, but in quite different ways. And I mean, the Health and Human Services thing in the United States was a complete innovation. And the thing that struck me was they said that it was the first time they got complete compliance to a federal grant program from all 50 states, because they'd done it in a more collaborative bottom-up and top-down format.
I think we've got some comments from
Yes,
YouTube.
a series of questions I'll try to summarize from Michael Fitzpatrick in Cambridgeshire. And he points out, although we have all these different units of local government, the distribution of them and the power they have is not helpful, and it doesn't provide a model for a federal Britain. And he takes the example of Cambridgeshire, which I know. We have district and county councils directly elected. We have a thing called Greater Cambridge, which is indirectly appointed by the existing councils. And then we have a mayor of this peculiar place called Cambridge and Peterborough, which have nothing in common. He's directly elected, but he has an assembly that's indirectly appointed. And what Michael Fitzpatrick asks is, surely this sort of piecemeal devolution doesn't work. Shouldn't we be looking at establishing regional government? And that would provide us with a federal model for the whole of fitting England into a federal UK.
Yes, I think that's an important question. So ask Colin and Joyce to comment on it, and then we'll have a final round of questions. I think Joyce and Colin.
I mean, my own preference would be for a system of regional government across England, but I am somewhat wary about just prescribing that, because that sort of, in a sense, goes down the sort of diktat from a central authority that this is what we're going to do, rather than going with the approach of Colin, which I found very interesting, which was in a sense building on things that we already have, but recognizing the kind of potential of local government and some of the other structures to improve the quality of our lives and improve the sort of decision-making machinery. Also, I am conscious of the fact that even in the Northeast, where there was a strong and is a strong regional identity, depending on circumstances, establishing regional government is quite difficult, and it also begs the question about the referendum. If we were moving towards a system of regional government, would we need referendums? I don't like the way that referendums have become part of the British system. It's been on a very ad hoc, ill thought out way. It was basically to suit particular governments at the time that we went down the referendum route, beginning with the Labour government's referendum on the European Community way back in the 70s. And I don't think we've really thought through the circumstances in which we should hold referendums, and also all those issues surrounding them in terms of thresholds and turnouts and all the rest of it. So I'm sorry to give a rather sort of wishy-washy answer. I mean, in many ways, I would love to see the kind of system that you have in Germany operating in England with regional governments across the board. But given the nature of England and the current situation, I'm just not convinced that it's realizable.
Colin, do you share those doubts?
Yeah, I think, yes, I do. And I think that I think we need to adopt a dual approach, if you like. The first is the sort of Royal Commission, top-down thinking about all these things, trying to promote a discussion about them, and trying to think about more rational ways of organising governments, plural, across the UK. But I also think we need to build on bottom-up examples of I'll give you one When I was still working in Manchester, I had some discussions with people who were involved in an alliance that had been set up to try and protect the moors. We've all seen the terrible fires that have taken place on some of the moors. And there were discussions going on, coordination between the water authorities, the people that own the moors or bits of them, local authorities, fire brigades, and various other actors to think about what they would do in the event of large fires and all of those sorts of things. And the one thing that struck me was there was one of the principals involved in it said to me, for God's sake, don't tell central government we're doing this, because they'll come in and wreck it. And that really struck me, that actually building from the bottom up, trying to create structures which actually achieve results for people in the locality seems to me to be an important element of this. And we spend probably too much time thinking about the more formal structures and constitutional principles and issues. Yes, that's important, and that's an important part of it, but I think we need to adopt both approaches.
Thanks, Brendan. Prior to retiring, I was a teacher of humanities at a comprehensive school. And to my regret, on 2 occasions, I failed to get the head teacher, 2 different head teachers, to introduce politics or civics into the school curriculum. Seems to me that if you're going to have, as I don't believe we have in this country, an articulate public when it comes to politics, that we start everything else at a very junior level in school, but it waits until we have to go to university and get the excellence of such as Professor Blicken. Dr. Talbot, before we are introduced to the political system, is there a way, any comments, where we can overcome this and make some more effort to get politics, civics, citizenship, whatever government introduced at least into the beginnings of high school, secondary school?
David, last question.
Yeah, and 3 cheers for the appeal to return to municipal government and to see that flourish. I think it does need a renaissance. But I'm going to ask a question about Parliament. A federal constitution, it seems, is most fitted to reforming the House of Lords. I think it's fair to say traditionally the House of Commons has been seen by the people of England as the English Parliament, we in Scotland and Wales obviously correctly see that the UK Parliament, but you can see with 85% of the population why there isn't this great problem of having separate representation, because Westminster is seen as England's Parliament. Is that situation, given that the evil is more or less abandoned now, will that just continue, or is there a lurking danger there that there may be cause for some form of lawmaking that is distinctly at the England level?
Colin, perhaps.
Well, we already have that to some extent with the English votes for English laws changes that were introduced. And yes, if you look at it at the federal level in a constitutional sense, of course, there has to be some, I think, adjustment for the fact that England doesn't have a separate lawmaking facility from the Westminster Parliament, which is the UK Parliament. And I think that needs to be thought through carefully. On the wider point about education, I absolutely 100% agree. I think part of the problem in the UK is because we don't have a written constitution, you can't do what they do in American schools, which is teach people about the Constitution in, I think, in high school mainly. But kids have at least a basic understanding of what the Constitution is in America because they get taught it at school. I know from our own kids going through school, it is supposed to be part of the national curriculum in the sort of social and whatever it is they call it. But I also know that there are virtually no teachers teaching it in any schools. I've been going into some schools and doing sessions with school pupils, and they've been absolutely fascinated and really interested and engaged. And I do think we need to find some way of promoting that within schools across the UK.
Joyce.
Yes, in terms of changes to the House of Commons, I must say, as I said before, I'm very reluctant to go down the route of a kind of English Parliament, simply because the size of the population in England is so great that you'd be almost just duplicating the over-centralism that traditionally we have had in a UK Houses of Parliament. So I really think we'd have to be very careful in going down that route. I think it under the present kind of system, it would make certain areas of England feel even more marginalised than they are now. I mean, traditionally, in an area like the North East, for example, it's been politically much closer to Scotland and Wales than it has to large swathes of southern England. That has changed a lot with the rise of the SNP, of course. But I just feel we've got to be very careful about this and perhaps think it through as part of an overall sort of Royal Commission, Constitutional Convention process, and not certainly not say, oh, an English Parliament is the answer. Not that I think that the questioner was actually saying that anyway. I do agree very strongly on the point with regard to sort of civic education. As a constituency member of Parliament, I was always very conscious of the differences between schools that took civics and classes about our governance seriously, and those that didn't. And I do think it's a very important part of informing citizens and young people who are going to be the adult citizens of the future about the issues of governance and how they relate to governance at all levels, and how they can influence and participate in those levels of government. So I very much endorse the points that were made about that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And we've all been very lucky to listen to two such well-informed and knowledgeable and enthusiastic, engaging speakers. Can we have a round of applause? And now to see us out, I think we want to have a repetition of the bagpipes, don't we?
If I can find
If they can be found. Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you very much, Joyce. We've got a 5 minutes break now, and then we'll come back for a summary from Andrew Blake. Thank you very much.